when you make the greatest game of all time, the chances that the sequel will be as good or better are slim. Aside from Half-Life 2, one could argue that no game set a higher bar for its sequel than the first Deus Ex. Though I personally don't believe that it's the greatest game ever made, I have gone on record with my belief that it is the most important game ever made. To roughly summarize my original argument, I don't believe any game has had greater, long-lasting influence in terms of its gameplay design while also having a story that is as profound and relevant now as it was 25 years ago. And let's not forget the most important thing, the fact that it's one of the most memeable games ever.
Candy bar, candy bar, candy bar, candy bar, candy bar, candy bar.
With all this in mind, the likelihood that the sequel would be at least as innovative and high quality is beyond slim. And unfortunately, various business and creative decisions made regarding Deus Ex's sequel ensured that it would be an impossibility.
I think in the end we made, an 85% rated RPG that was not a worthy sequel to the original game in terms of how interesting the original game was, and that's unfortunate.
Deus Ex Invisible War is a game that even the game's director apologized for, and honestly, it's easy to see why. Virtually every aspect of this game feels like a regression, like it's taking a step or two backward from the original's brilliance. I have yet to hear a single criticism of Invisible War's gameplay, story, music, or visual and technical presentation that I didn't agree with. Well, with the exception of the criticism that every NPC in the game looks like they just left their first war zone and developed the 1,000-yard stare. That's not a problem, that's just a beautiful accident, like how humanity discovered that you could drink cow milk. But aside from that, the game is plagued with things like overly simplified gameplay, a convoluted and occasionally nonsensical story, and aside from graphical fidelity, every aspect of the game's technical makeup is an objective downgrade. For these reasons, it might be hard for those just learning about Invisible War to understand, as the project lead Harvey Smith pointed out a moment ago, why it rated so highly upon its release. Was this like the video game equivalent of Star Wars prequel copium? As a matter of fact, I would argue no. As I just said, Invisible War feels like a step or two backwards in quality. Well, if the original game is a 9 or 10 out of 10, Invisible War feels like a 7 overall, with 8 out of 10 moments throughout. By my interpretation of a 1 to 10 scale, a 7 is a good game. If you do like I did and ignore the existence of the original Deus Ex while playing Invisible War, you might be able to put aside your list of things that the game does worse and start to appreciate the things that the game still does well. First, the core gameplay of the original Deus Ex is preserved, and it is still pretty fun, even if the differences in detail drag it down a bit. Though the technical presentation is below the original, it is still solid overall. But what I believe deserves the most attention is the game's story, which, though problematic in a number of ways, does still feature moments of high-quality science fiction and philosophy that helped make the original game a timeless classic. On top of that, it too has a sort of predictive element like the first game did. Where the first game presented a future that I feel is kind of inevitable, with artificial intelligence and human augmentation becoming universal, Invisible War deals with some of the logical consequences of that human revolution. I'm sorry, that was so gross. Never again. Today, I want to take a look back at Invisible War, acknowledge all the things it got wrong, but also give massive credit where so many other reviewers have not. Before I jump into things, I will kindly ask that if you like this video, or have liked my past analyses, please give this video a like. That helps me out more than you understand. Also, if you want to help support the in-depth analysis that I do here, please consider supporting me on Patreon or joining my YouTube membership section. I will leave links to both in the description box below. Now, without further ado, let's jump into what I believe is the underrated Deus Ex Invisible War. If you were to collectively ask gamers what the best year for gaming was, what year had the greatest number of all-time great games released, I think one of the best contenders is 2001. That year, we saw the release of Metal Gear Solid 2, Silent Hill 2, Halo Combat Evolved, Final Fantasy X, Devil May Cry, and that's just to name a few. To turn things back to the subject of importance, however, I don't think that there was a more important game that released that year than Grand Theft Auto 3. Where the first Deus Ex created a gameplay formula that maximized player freedom and blended genres together, GTA 3 did the same thing but for open-world video games.
The most validating thing that's happened in the last couple of years was the release of Grand Theft Auto 3.
The director for the original Deus Ex, Warren Spector, was particularly taken by GTA 3's success because it married some of the simulatory gameplay he introduced with Deus Ex to their open-world formula. In respect to Invisible War, however, Spector felt that GTA 3 proved that a simulation game can not only work and be massively successful, but more relevantly, it could work on console.
You know, I played one PC game from start to finish last year. I played so many more hours of console games last year than I did PC games, it's not even funny.
This warming towards the console market was one reason why Invisible War was made primarily for the original Xbox, and then ported to PC, whereas the original game was made for the PC and then ported to the PS2. But this was not the only reason behind this change in approach. Both Harvey Smith and Warren Spector have spoken about how the development of Invisible War was influenced by their industry peers, telling them what they felt was wrong with the original game and how it could have been improved.
We listened to our super hardcore friends who told us, here's how I would fix Deus Ex, and we really felt sensitive about that. We really felt like, God, we're not meeting the demands, or we're not meeting the standards of our very intelligent designer friends.
I am very curious to know who these designer friends were who looked at a masterpiece like Deus Ex and were like, yeah, no. That's like looking at the Mona Lisa and saying, I don't know, maybe I'd like it if she had eyebrows. Based on what I could gather, it seems the things that Smith and Spector's peers were pointing to were the things that might either be too complex or inaccessible to a mainstream audience, which then led to a streamlining of the original's gameplay systems. What they didn't realize is that while a few of their efforts in this regard worked, the majority of their efforts compromised so many of the quirks and intricacies that gave the first Deus Ex's gameplay its charm and committed fanbase. Unfortunately, the combination of a commitment to accessibility plus development for consoles first played the largest role in compromising Invisible War's gameplay experience. Starting with the latter of those two problems, the first Deus Ex benefited from being developed for PC because PCs tend to have greater memory capacity and processing power. This in turn allowed for bigger, more immersive environments along with a greater number of ways to approach an objective. However, when developing Invisible War for the Xbox, the amount of RAM they had to work with went from an average of about 256 megabytes down to 64, along with a generally less powerful CPU. Though the developers were able to use this infrastructure to create better looking environments, the size of the levels and what you could do within them were cut down. For comparison, the first level of the original Deus Ex had all of Liberty Island to explore without any load screens. But in Invisible War, load screens are omnipresent, because you can only travel 15 seconds in any direction before you have to go through another door and load the next level. Another unfortunate consequence of these technical limitations is that you're often forced to be indoors most of the time. While the interiors generally look pretty good for a game released in 2003, they lack the personality and immersion of the first game's wide-open cities and military bases. Granted, the developers did what they could to preserve the emergent, player-empowering gameplay from the original with these restrictions, and what is there works well enough. It's just not of the same quantity and quality. It's like going from a puzzle that has 400 pieces to a puzzle that has 100 pieces. It's the same core gameplay, and it's fun, but it asks much less of you. And unfortunately, that's a common theme throughout Invisible War. Hardware limitations weren't the only excuse for the game's compression and simplification. The design ethos behind Invisible War focused on taking the original game's experience and making it more accessible. Now, in the developers' defense, it seems like their intention to make the game accessible didn't equate in their minds to making the game easier. Warren Spector and fellow Invisible War developer Ricardo Barre said as much. I imagine that their intention was similar to how Elden Ring ended up being so popular despite being as difficult, if not more so, than its predecessor, the Dark Souls series. Despite their good intentions, however, the result was something that even I, somebody who prefers more relaxing games, found to be offensively easy. Some of the ways in which they streamlined the original's gameplay aren't objectively bad though. In fact, I prefer some of the changes, like not having to manually input passwords, having just one health bar instead of one dedicated to each body part, or being able to automatically shoot straight instead of having to aim your gun. However, it's totally valid if you disagree with me and think that those elements were quintessential to your immersion within the original game. Whatever the case may be, I think that the experience ended up being a general downgrade for both hardcore and casual fans because there were just too many of these types of changes. Let's go down the list. In the original game, you had to use both lockpicks and multi-tools in order to access certain areas, of which there was a limited amount, which forced the gamer to constantly strategize regarding when and if they should use them. In Invisible War, there's now just multi-tools, and I was never short on any of them. I was able to Alohomora myself into any locked door or security system that I wanted. Second, universal ammo. Now this is part of a bigger problem that Invisible War has that I will go into later, in that it jumps from somewhat grounded sci-fi into pure fantasy, but let's just stick with gameplay for now. In the original game, you had different types of ammo for each weapon, which forced the gamer to be strategic about which guns they used for which situation, and if they would be willing to carry more guns at the expense of, say, health items. In Invisible War, having one type of ammo that can be used in every type of weapon, and again having a massive amount of it, removes that strategic element. Then there's the augments, which, when you were able to augment yourself in the original game, was a significant event. But here, you're never short on any of them, and they make you way too powerful. I don't think I have ever encountered a game where normal difficulty was this easy. Normal difficulty on the original Deus Ex was fun because it felt like the challenge slowly scaled up over the course of the game, constantly challenging your preferred playstyle and builds, and perniciously eating away at your resources. With Invisible War, there was rarely a time when I didn't have full health, energy, and ammo. In short, Invisible War seems to focus less on fostering the player's creativity and sense of role-playing. In fact, it shouldn't even have been marketed as an action RPG because the game gutted more of its RPG elements than Final Fantasy XVI. Upgrading skills was one of the best parts of the original Deus Ex, so why would you get rid of it in Invisible War? So when you combine less intuitive and far simpler gameplay and put it inside a game which, generally speaking, is only half as long as the original, it's easy to see why people felt disappointed. Despite all of that though, I still had fun with the game because the core gameplay remained intact. I was still able to pick the way I wanted to play, which is always and forever non-lethal and stealth. And trying to play that way came with a not good, but satisfactory degree of challenge. The guns, especially the mag rail, are surprisingly fun to use and customize. And even though the augments are plentiful and really easy to get, they make the gameplay not only more dynamic, but joyful. Honestly, there are few times in the past year that I had more fun than when I upgraded my strength ability to max and hurled bodies across a level into a dumpster. Pro tip for all game developers, anytime you add ragdoll physics to your game, that's an instant point out of 10 in your favor. Just saying. Of course, this all depends on whether or not you're able to ignore the existence of the original game and negate your attachment to its systems. If you're like me in that regard, or several of the reviewers that played this game on release, you will probably have a decent experience. Though the gameplay lacks the innovation and immersion of the original, thankfully the same can't be said about its story. An unfortunate fact of the discussion surrounding this game is that a lot of people ignore or conveniently forget its moments of philosophical introspection and conspiratorial intrigue. However, in order to get to those moments, you have to endure a plot that on multiple occasions makes absolutely no sense. As I said before, part of what made the first game's story so profound is it provided a grounded vision of our future, of how technology would evolve the human body and civilization. But the technology in Invisible War oftentimes might as well be magic. Seriously, this game relies more on nanomachines as an explanation for the supernatural than Metal Gear Solid 4.
Nanomachines.
Nanomachines. Nanomachines.
Nanomachines.
Nanomachine.
Nanomachine. Nanomachines.
Nanomachine. Nanomachine. Nanomachine.
Nanomachine. Nanomachines.
Oh, sorry, not nanomachines, they're called nanites in Invisible War, sorry. To explain my point, you need look no further than the game's opening cutscene. In the year 2072, 2 decades after the original Deus Ex, a terrorist uses a nanite detonator in the middle of the American city of Chicago. When the bomb is set off, the nanites in that bomb self-replicate, destroying everything in its path. By the way, a fun fact, the notion of self-replicating nanites consuming the world references a doomsday scenario proposed by K. Eric Drexler, an American engineer and researcher of nanotechnology. He called it a gray goo event, which is appropriate because that is exactly what the stuff looks like in the game. Now, it's not necessarily the idea of nanites self-replicating that I have an issue with, it's the fact that the nanites somehow limited themselves only to Chicago. How did that happen? Did the terrorists have an off switch for these quadrillions of little machines? How can they be certain that 1 or 2 wouldn't accidentally be unaffected by the off switch and continue to multiply? The answer? Or how about the universal ammo that I mentioned before? You know, the ammo that works in both pistols and rocket launchers? As somebody who has such a limited knowledge of guns that he thinks a pump-action shotgun has no effect at long range, sorry about that. I do feel pretty safe in saying that such a concept is virtually magic. All this greatly takes away from the original's beautiful marriage of realism and fiction. But honestly, the thing that feels most unrealistic in this game has nothing to do with the technology. Rather, it has to do with what should have been Invisible War's greatest new feature. In the game, you have the choice of completing side missions for 4 different factions. This could have been really cool, giving you incentive to play the game again just to see what variation the story has. The problem is that no matter which side quests you complete, there are no consequences for choosing 1, 2, or all sides. The only meaningful decisions you make happen in the last 10 minutes of the game, when you're picking which ending you want. Sorry, wrong footage. Even when you do things in side missions that upset the other factions, they'll be like, yeah, we know you killed that guy that was working for us, but you better not do that again, or we'll just keep offering you work. Honestly, I have an easier time believing in universal ammo than in that level of job security. Although granted, I could work for the Canadian government. It's such a shame because a lot of these fantastical elements tend to obscure some otherwise solid writing, which also provides many interesting perspectives on the future of humanity. It continues the discussion surrounding the philosophical subjects present in the original game, regarding things like corporate consolidation, the influence of AI on our lives, and whether body augmentation is something that every human being will have to adapt to. A great example of this involves 2 of the 4 aforementioned factions, one known as the Order and the other being the World Trade Organization. Following the ending of the first game, when the internet gets destroyed and the world falls into a period of economic recession, these 2 organizations came under the influence of the Illuminati as a way to re-establish their global control. They would consolidate wealth through the WTO and religion through the Order, before unifying both into a single world government. However, for most of the game, these 2 factions are presented as if they were at war with one another, which was done purposefully by the Illuminati because, well, nothing will unite people more effectively than if they have an enemy to contend with. Though the way the story and the gameplay handled this reveal is a complete and utter failure, the discussion surrounding it is nonetheless interesting. It's an effective extension of the first game's commentary on the human desire for convenient narratives to give their lives meaning, which is a vulnerability that corporations and governments prey on. The whole concept of the Order is particularly fascinating. It seeks to unify the religions of the world into a single organization and doctrine. Now, the big fantastical problem here, obviously, is there's no way something like this will happen in the next 47 years. Again, I'm putting more faith in the creation of universal ammo than I am in that. That said, I personally believe that this is the direction that humanity is heading in. It probably won't happen for 1,000 years, but even now, I think the trends speak to this reality. For the last few hundred years, religious adherence has been declining thanks to the effects of Enlightenment-era philosophy and science challenging superstitious dogma. However, as philosophers like Nietzsche pointed out, the loss of a moral framework predicated around concepts like God or reward in the afterlife would cause the suffering we experience in this life to potentially lose its meaning. Which is why we've recently seen a small uptick of people going back to church, for example. Despite that though, the issues that made people leave religion in the first place never went away. So I believe that over the next few centuries, we'll see people embrace religion, but it will be something like a synthesis of the values that are common across all religions, while also questioning and doing away with at least some of the superstitious dogma. While I think the idea of this happening in half a century is laughable, I think it is another example of the brilliant forward thinking of the game's writer, Sheldon Bocote, who also wrote the first Deus Ex along with its accurate predictions. But perhaps the most interesting idea in the game is the one proposed by the first game's main character, J.C. Denton, that being his idea of a post-human society. Now, if I were to summarize what that idea is, it's unironically the song 46 and 2 by Tool, where the next stage of human evolution is the adoption of a collective consciousness while simultaneously keeping one sense of individual identity. The only difference is that evolution won't be facilitated by the acquisition of 2 new chromosomes, but rather by connecting human beings to a digital network, run by the AI equivalent of God. With this technology, JC aims to augment the bodies and minds of all humankind to a state of equality. No longer will the random whims of nature dictate a person's state of wealth, health, or intelligence upon their birth. Instead, everybody will be on an even playing field. No longer will people have to rely on generalities in order to understand the complexity of the universe or explain it to those of lesser intelligence. We can instantaneously understand complex issues via our connection to God, and in turn, manage societies more effectively via what JC calls an instantaneous pure democracy. And let's not forget, this would theoretically solve humanity's need for God, as we discussed a moment ago. On the surface, this seems like a lovely idea and the logical outcome of humanity's collective augmentation. But it's also fair to say that any time humanity has tried to play God, there were consequences both unforeseen and predictable. As is pointed out in the game, such a construct would require humanity to forego the entire concept of privacy, as both JC and the Helios AI would have access to your mind at all times. Plus, let's not neglect the fact that with any form of technology, a miscalculation could be made, or some force of nature could cause the whole project to break down. After all, the whole premise of Invisible War centers around the fact that JC's merger with the Helios AI in the first game didn't work, and he had to go into hibernation for years until this game's main character, Alex Denton, who is a clone of JC, came along to help him. Why should we trust that this time is any different? What if a solar flare creates an EMP pulse which knocks out the entire network? It would be bad enough if this knocked out the entire internet. How bad would it be when our entire minds and bodies relied on this link to God? Is this a risk we would be willing to take? Would it be better to worship an invisible yet supposedly perfect God? Or assume we could create a perfect God with our imperfect hands? Personally, I think this philosophical conundrum is something that is interesting to think about, but not something we should concern ourselves with too much at this moment. Though we are starting to augment the human mind, the technology is nowhere near the sophistication that it is in the Deus Ex games, and nowhere near mass market affordability. But the moment that it is, the question of whether to augment or not to augment will be the first philosophical conundrum we must tackle. Thankfully, we don't have to have that conversation for another... Wait, when did human revolution take place? 2 years from now? Dude, we're so